Wyatt Nash had never been caught dead within 10 paces of a dance floor in all his 32 years of living. Even as bullets whizzed past his head during the war, he'd sworn he'd rather face a firing squad than twirl a woman around to the sound of fiddles and harmonicas. It wasn't that he couldn't, he simply wouldn't. Not since that spring night in '59 when everything he'd ever known or loved had gone up in flames while he was busy stepping in time to the Arkansas Traveler. The town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, had seen its share of strange characters since the silver boom of '76, but none quite as confounding as Wyatt. Tall and broad-shouldered with perpetually sun-weathered skin, he moved with the quiet confidence of a mountain lion. His dark hair, always a bit too long, curled slightly beneath the brim of a well-worn Stetson that had survived adventures his lips would never recount. Most noticeable, though, was the jagged scar that ran from his right temple down to his jaw, a permanent reminder of choices made and paths not taken. Folks knew better than to ask about it. Wyatt had come to Redemption Creek 3 years ago, bought the failing Morgan Ranch 10 miles outside town, renamed it Lone Pine, and through stubborn determination, had turned it into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory. He employed a dozen men, paid fair wages, and expected hard work in return. Beyond that, he kept to himself, came to town only when necessary, and left as quickly as possible, especially during social gatherings. "I swear, Mr. Nash, you'd think dancing was some kind of mortal sin the way you avoid it," Martha Holloway, the owner of the general store, said one afternoon as Wyatt paid for supplies. "The Harvest Festival's coming up next weekend. Wouldn't hurt you to join in for once." Wyatt counted out exact change, his expression unchanged. "Got cattle to tend, Mrs. Holloway." "Cattle don't need tending every minute of every day," she countered, pushing a peppermint stick across the counter. "Take this. Sweeten that sour disposition of yours." He ignored the candy. "Will that be all?" Martha sighed dramatically. "You know, a man your age ought to be thinking about settling down. Can't do that if you never socialize. Not looking to settle any more than I already have." He tipped his hat and gathered his supplies. "Good day, Mrs. Holloway." Outside, Redemption Creek bustled with afternoon activity. The town had grown substantially in the past few years, boasting nearly 800 souls, 2 saloons, a hotel, a schoolhouse, and even a small opera house that doubled as a dance hall during community celebrations. Progress had arrived in the form of telegraph lines last year, and rumors circulated that the railroad might consider a spur line if the silver mines continued to produce. Wyatt secured his purchases to his saddle when a commotion down the street caught his attention. A stage coach had arrived and passengers were disembarking in front of the Grand Hotel. Nothing unusual there. The stage came through twice weekly, but something about the final passenger made him pause. She stepped down with surprising grace considering the height of the carriage step. Dressed in a practical but well-made traveling suit of deep blue, she surveyed her surroundings with keen interest, rather than the typical disgust or disappointment that marked most new arrivals to their dusty town. Her hair, the warm brown of autumn chestnuts, was arranged sensibly beneath a modest hat, and even from a distance, Wyatt could see her posture spoke of confidence and purpose. He looked away before she could catch him staring, mounted his horse, and rode out of town at a deliberate pace. Whatever business brought a woman like that to Redemption Creek was none of his concern. He was wrong. 2 days later, Sheriff Tom Raleigh rode out to Lone Pine, arriving just as Wyatt and his men were bringing in a small herd from the north pasture. "Bit off your usual route, aren't you, Sheriff?" Wyatt called, directing his horse alongside the lawman's. Tom Raleigh was a decent sort, honest and fair, if a bit too fond of his own authority. "Got a situation in town that concerns you," he said without preamble. "If it's about Jeb getting rowdy at the saloon again, I already docked his pay and told him." "It's not about your men," Raleigh interrupted. "It's about your land." Wyatt's expression hardened. "What about my land?" "That woman who arrived on Tuesday's stage, name's Tabitha Zimmerman. Says she's the niece of old Morgan who owned this place before you." Tension coiled in Wyatt's shoulders. "Morgan didn't have family." "Seems he did. Miss Zimmerman's got papers, letters, legal documents. Says her uncle wrote to her before he died, but the letters got delayed. She's claiming there might be some irregularity with the sale." "There was nothing irregular," Wyatt said flatly. "I paid fair price to the bank after Morgan's debts were settled. Got the deed signed by Judge Wilson himself." "I'm not saying otherwise," Raleigh held up his hands placatingly. "Just letting you know she's asking questions. Might want to come to town, straighten things out before rumors start flying." Wyatt considered this. "I'll come tomorrow." "She's staying at the hotel, seems educated, teaches music back east somewhere." Music. Despite himself, Wyatt's interest was piqued. "Piano, singing, that sort of thing. Apparently she's been hired to teach at the new school. This land business is separate." After the sheriff left, Wyatt spent the evening reviewing his property papers, though he knew everything was in order. He'd been meticulous about the purchase, making sure every legal requirement was satisfied. Still, he recognized that even the suggestion of impropriety could cause problems. Redemption Creek might be growing, but it was still small enough that gossip spread faster than wildfires in August. The next morning, he dressed with slightly more care than usual, selecting a newer shirt and bothering to trim his beard before heading to town. He told himself it was simply appropriate for a business meeting, nothing to do with the woman herself. He found Tabitha Zimmerman in the hotel dining room, papers spread before her as she ate breakfast. Up close, she was even more striking than his first impression suggested. Her features were delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and a determined chin. Her eyes, a clear hazel that shifted between green and gold depending on how the light hit them, looked up as he approached. "Miss Zimmerman?" he asked, removing his hat. She set down her fork. "Yes, Wyatt Nash. I understand you have questions about Lone Pine Ranch." Recognition flickered across her face. "Mr. Nash?" "Yes, please join me." She gestured to the chair across from her. Wyatt sat, placing his hat on an empty chair. "Sheriff Raleigh mentioned your concerns. I appreciate you coming into town." Her voice was pleasant, with the refined accent of someone educated back east, but lacking the condescension that often accompanied it. "I want to be clear, I'm not contesting your ownership outright. I'm simply trying to understand what happened to my uncle's property." "Your uncle never mentioned family," Wyatt said bluntly. A shadow crossed her face. "We were estranged for many years. My father, his brother, had a falling out with him before I was born. I only began corresponding with Uncle Morgan about 2 years ago." She slid several yellowed envelopes toward him. "These arrived too late. He was already gone when they were returned to me." Wyatt didn't touch the letters. "I bought the property legally. Morgan had debts. The bank foreclosed after his death. I purchased it at auction." "I understand that," she said, studying him with those disconcerting eyes. "And truthfully, I'm not looking to reclaim the ranch. My concern is personal effects. In his letters, Uncle Morgan mentioned certain family heirlooms, including my grandmother's wedding ring and some personal papers. Items of sentimental value only." She hesitated. "He also mentioned a piano." Wyatt's jaw tightened. There was indeed a piano at Lone Pine, a fine instrument that had been inexplicably abandoned in the main house, gathering dust in the corner of what had once been a formal parlor. He'd never touched it. "There is a piano," he acknowledged. "It wasn't listed in the property inventory, so I assumed it came with the house." "It was my grandmother's," Tabitha said softly. "Uncle Morgan had it shipped from Boston at great expense when he built the house. My grandmother taught him to play as a boy." She straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Nash, I'm not here to cause trouble. I've accepted a teaching position in Redemption Creek and plan to stay. I simply hope to recover a few items that mean a great deal to my family." Wyatt found himself in an unexpected position. Everything about his legal claim to Lone Pine was solid, but he couldn't deny the sincerity in her eyes or the evidence of the letters before him. "You're welcome to come identify what's yours," he said finally. "I didn't dispose of Morgan's personal effects. Most are still boxed in the attic." Relief softened her features. "Thank you. That's most generous. As for the piano—" He hesitated. The thought of music returning to that silent house stirred uncomfortable memories. "It's yours if you want it, though transporting it to town won't be easy." Tabitha's smile transformed her face, creating small dimples at the corners of her mouth. "Actually, I've been looking for accommodations in town. The hotel is lovely but expensive for a long-term stay. I wondered if perhaps there might be a tenant house or cabin on Lone Pine property I could rent. That way, I could visit the piano regularly, even if moving it proves difficult." The request caught him off guard. "You want to live at Lone Pine?" "Not in the main house, of course," she clarified quickly. "Just somewhere on the property. I'd pay fair rent, and it would only be until I find something suitable in town." Wyatt thought of the foreman's cabin, vacant since he'd promoted Diego Rodriguez to foreman last year, and the man had moved his family into larger quarters closer to the bunkhouse. It was small but sound, with 2 rooms and a decent stove. "There's a cabin," he said slowly. "It would need some fixing up." "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Nash," he believed her. Despite her refined manners and education, there was a practical air about her that suggested she wasn't some delicate Eastern flower who would wilt at the first sign of frontier hardship. "I'll have it readied," he decided. "You can come out day after tomorrow to look at it and go through your uncle's belongings." "Thank you." She extended her hand across the table. Wyatt hesitated briefly before taking it. Her grip was firmer than he expected, her skin warm against his calloused palm. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest, a sensation he promptly ignored. "Day after tomorrow, then," he said, retrieving his hat and rising to leave. "Mr. Nash," she called as he turned away. Would it be terribly presumptuous to ask for a ride out to the ranch? The stagecoach doesn't go that direction, and hiring a wagon would be costly. He nodded once. "I'll come for you at 9. True to his word, Wyatt arrived at the Grand Hotel precisely at 9 o'clock 2 mornings later. He'd spent the previous day having Diego and 2 ranch hands clean the foreman's cabin from top to bottom, replace a broken window, and repair the sagging front step. He told himself it was simply good business to have a presentable property for a paying tenant. But Diego's knowing smirk suggested his foreman suspected other motivations. Tabitha was waiting in the hotel lobby, dressed in a practical green riding skirt and white blouse, her hair tucked neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A small trunk and 2 carpet bags sat beside her. "Optimistic, aren't you?" Wyatt commented, nodding toward her luggage. She smiled. "Prepared. If the cabin isn't suitable, I'll simply bring these back. If it is, I'll be ready to stay." He found himself admiring her practicality. "Let's load them up, then." The ride to Lone Pine took just under an hour. Wyatt had brought the small ranch wagon rather than his horse, allowing space for Tabitha and her belongings. As they traveled, she asked intelligent questions about the operation of the ranch, the local economy, and the community of Redemption Creek. "How long have you been in Colorado Territory, Mr. Nash?" she asked as they crested a hill that offered the first view of lone pines spread out below them. "Long enough," he answered vaguely. "You mentioned you're from back east." She accepted his deflection gracefully. "Boston, originally. After my parents died of influenza when I was 16, I lived with my mother's sister in Philadelphia. I taught music at a girls' seminary there until recently." "Why leave that for Redemption Creek?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the landscape. "Sometimes a person needs to start fresh." The West seemed to offer that opportunity. He understood that sentiment all too well but didn't say so. Lone Pine Ranch had been named for the solitary ponderosa pine that stood sentinel near the main house, a house that had once been grand by frontier standards, but had fallen into disrepair under Morgan's ownership. Wyatt had focused on restoring the outbuildings and cattle operations first, leaving the main house functional but sparse. As they approached, Tabitha took in the sprawling property with obvious interest. The main house was a two-story structure built of local stone and timber. A barn large enough to house 20 horses stood nearby, along with a bunkhouse, cookhouse, smithy, and various storage buildings. Corrals and fenced pastures spread outward in all directions, with cattle visible in the distance. Men on horseback moved among the herds while others worked around the outbuildings. "It's larger than I expected," Tabitha remarked. "Nearly 15,000 acres, Wyatt said, allowing a note of pride to enter his voice. "Good grazing land, reliable water sources." He drove past the main house toward a small cabin set about 200 yards away, partially sheltered by a stand of aspens whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. The cabin was simple but solid, with a small covered porch and newly repaired steps. "This would be your accommodation," he said, drawing the wagon to a halt. Tabitha studied it thoughtfully. "May I look inside?" "Of course." He helped her down from the wagon, momentarily aware of the slender strength of her waist beneath his hands. She ascended the steps and pushed open the door while he remained outside, allowing her privacy to explore. The cabin consisted of a main room with a cook stove, table and chairs, and a smaller bedroom separated by a curtained doorway. Diego's wife had placed wildflowers in a jar on the table and hung fresh curtains on the window's touches Wyatt hadn't ordered but was suddenly grateful for. After a few minutes, Tabitha emerged, her expression pleased. "It's perfect, Mr. Nash. How much rent would you consider fair?" They negotiated briefly before settling on a figure that was reasonable for both. "You understand there's no running water," he warned. "The well is 30 yards behind the cabin, and winter gets harsh up here." "I'm sturdier than I look," she assured him. "And I won't be walking to town to teach when snow flies. I've already arranged to board with the Reverend's family during the worst months." With that settled, Wyatt helped unload her belongings into the cabin. "Would you like to see the main house now, to look through your uncle's things?" Tabitha nodded, and they walked the short distance to the ranch house. Wyatt was suddenly conscious of its austere appearance through fresh eyes, the sparsely furnished rooms, the lack of decoration, the general feeling of a place where someone existed rather than lived. "The piano's in there," he said, gesturing toward the parlor. Tabitha moved past him, her steps quickening as she entered the room. The piano stood in the corner, its once gleaming surface dulled by years of neglect. She approached it reverently, running her fingers along the carved wood. "Grandmother's piano," she murmured. "May I?" At his nod, she lifted the fallboard and pressed a key. The note rang out, surprisingly in tune despite its disuse. She played a simple chord progression, then smiled at the sound. "It needs proper tuning, but it's in remarkably good condition," she said, Uncle Morgan must have maintained it. He played sometimes, Wyatt found himself saying. Late at night, you could hear it from the bunkhouse when I first came to work here. Tabitha's eyes widened slightly. You worked for my uncle before purchasing the ranch. Wyatt hadn't meant to reveal that personal detail. For a short time, as a hand. She seemed to sense his discomfort and didn't press further. Would it be possible to see the attic now, for my grandmother's ring and the family papers? The attic was accessed through a narrow staircase off the upstairs hallway. Dust motes danced in the slanted beams of light from small windows at either end of the space. Wooden trunks and cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, containing the accumulated possessions of the Morgan family. I never sorted through any of it, Wyatt admitted. Didn't seem right to dispose of it, but had no use for it either. Thank you for preserving it, Tabitha said sincerely. This means more than I can express. Over the next 2 hours, they examined the contents of trunks and boxes. Tabitha occasionally exclaiming over found treasures, her grandmother's handwritten recipe book, a family Bible with births and deaths recorded inside the cover, framed daguerreotypes of stern-faced ancestors. Eventually, she found a small rosewood box containing her grandmother's ring, a delicate gold band set with a modest pearl. Uncle Morgan kept it all these years, she said wonderingly, slipping it onto her finger where it fit perfectly. Even after the rift with my father. Wyatt, watching her from across the dusty attic, felt something shift inside him at the genuine emotion on her face. This woman's connection to her past, to family that had gone before, touched something long buried in his own heart. You're welcome to take whatever has meaning to you, he said gruffly. I've no attachment to any of it. She looked up, studying him with those perceptive eyes. Everyone should have attachments, Mr. Nash. They're what make a house a home. He didn't respond to that. Attachments were dangerous. They gave the world leverage to hurt you. Better to stand alone, needing nothing and no one. By late afternoon, Tabitha had sorted through most of what interested her, setting aside items to take to the cabin. Among her discoveries were sheets of music, handwritten by her grandmother and uncle. I should get back to my duties, Wyatt said finally. Diego, my foreman, will help you transport these items to your cabin. Is there anything else you need? She hesitated. Would you mind terribly if I spent some time with the piano before I go? It's been so long since I've played a proper instrument. The thought of music filling the empty house again was disconcerting, but he couldn't reasonably refuse. Take your time. I'll tell Diego to wait until you're ready. As he turned to leave, she called after him. Mr. Nash, thank you again, for everything. He nodded once and descended the stairs, but instead of immediately heading to the barn, he found himself pausing in the hallway as the first notes of music drifted from the parlor. The melody was unfamiliar, but haunting, something classical that spoke of both sadness and hope. Wyatt stood there longer than he intended, listening as Tabitha Zimmerman brought life back to a corner of his house that had been silent for too long. Over the next 2 weeks, Wyatt and Tabitha settled into a cautious coexistence. She was an unobtrusive tenant, keeping to herself and maintaining her little cabin meticulously. 3 times weekly, she traveled to town to teach music at the school, either catching a ride with one of the ranch hands heading that direction, or occasionally borrowing a gentle mare Wyatt had designated for her use. In the evenings, she often visited the main house to play the piano, always asking permission first. Wyatt typically made himself scarce during these sessions, finding ranch work that needed his attention. But sometimes, despite his better judgment, he found himself lingering within earshot, the music calling to him like a half-remembered dream. One evening, returning late from checking on a pregnant heifer, He was surprised to find lights still burning in the main house. As he approached, he heard not just piano music but singing Tabitha's clear soprano lifting in a folk song his mother had sung when he was very young. He stood frozen outside the parlor door, memories washing over him with painful clarity. His mother at their small piano in Tennessee, her voice sweet and pure. His father, normally stern and distant, softening as he listened from his armchair. Wyatt himself, just a boy, sitting at her feet and believing the world would always contain such perfect moments. He must have made some sound, for the music stopped abruptly. "Mr. Nash," Tabitha called. He considered retreating but instead pushed the door open. "It's late. Didn't expect you to be here." She looked slightly embarrassed. "I lost track of time." "The acoustics in this room are quite remarkable, much better than in my cabin." She began gathering her music sheets. "I apologize if I disturbed you." "You didn't," he said honestly, then surprising himself. "My mother used to sing that song." Tabitha stilled. "Did she? It's a lovely piece." "She played piano too, not as well as you." The compliment seemed to please her. "Music often carries strong memories. Was your mother musical?" "She tried to teach me when I was young. I had no patience for it." The admission came unbidden, part of a past he rarely acknowledged. Tabitha smiled. "Few young boys do. Perhaps you'd have more patience now." The suggestion caught him off guard. "I have no interest in learning piano, Miss Zimmerman." "Of course," she said quickly. "It was just a thought." She finished gathering her music. "I should return to my cabin. It's getting late." "I'll walk you," he said, the offer automatic. Outside, the October night was clear and cool. Stars scattered across the vast Colorado sky like diamond dust. They walked in silence for several moments, the only sounds their footsteps and the distant lowing of cattle. "The Harvest Festival is this weekend," Tabitha said eventually. "Will you be attending?" "No," Wyatt replied flatly. "Oh," she seemed disappointed. "I've been asked to play piano for some of the dancing. It would be my first real community function since arriving." "You'll do fine." She glanced at him curiously. "Do you dislike dancing, Mr. Nash?" "I don't dance," he said with finality. "Never, or just not anymore?" The question was too perceptive, cutting too close to truths he kept buried. "I don't see how that's relevant, Miss Zimmerman." They had reached her cabin door. In the moonlight, her expression was thoughtful but not offended by his brusqueness. "Perhaps it isn't. Thank you for the escort, Mr. Nash. Good night." "Good night, Miss Zimmerman." As he walked back to the main house, Wyatt cursed himself for engaging in even that much personal conversation. It led nowhere good. Tabitha Zimmerman was his tenant, nothing more. The fact that her music stirred unwanted memories, or that her smile sometimes lingered in his thoughts, was irrelevant. He had built a life carefully constructed to prevent entanglements, and he had no intention of changing that now. The Harvest Festival was Redemption Creek's biggest social event of the year. The entire community gathered at the town square and the adjacent opera house for food, games, music, and dancing. Farmers displayed their best produce, craftsmen showed their wares, and everyone celebrated the bounty of another year before winter set in. Despite his stated intention to avoid it, Wyatt found himself riding into town late Saturday afternoon, telling himself he needed supplies that couldn't wait until Monday. The fact that he wore a new shirt purchased last month but never worn was coincidental. Redemption Creek hummed with activity. Bunting and lanterns decorated the square, tables groaned with food, and children darted between adults engaged in conversation. A makeshift stage had been set up where various townsfolk demonstrated talents, everything from harmonica playing to recitations of epic poetry. Wyatt tethered his horse at the hitching post outside the mercantile, nodding greetings to acquaintances but avoiding lengthy conversations. He just finished purchasing totally unnecessary items when Martha Holloway cornered him. Well, if it isn't Wyatt Nash. "I do believe hell has frozen over," she declared, loud enough for nearby customers to turn and stare. "Just getting supplies, Mrs. Holloway," he muttered. "And it couldn't possibly wait until Monday?" she asked with exaggerated innocence. "Nothing to do with a certain music teacher who's about to perform, I suppose." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," Martha laughed. "Of course you don't. Well, since you're here, you might as well stay for Miss Zimmerman's performance. She's playing in about 10 minutes. The whole town's talking about her, such a refined lady but not at all stuck up. And living out at your ranch, quite the topic of speculation, let me tell you." Alarm flared through him. "There's nothing to speculate about. She's renting the old foreman's cabin." "That's all. If you say so, dear." Martha patted his arm condescendingly. "Oh, there's Reverend Williams. I must speak with him about the church bazaar. Enjoy the festival, Mr. Nash." Left alone, Wyatt considered leaving immediately, but found his feet carrying him toward the opera house where a crowd was gathering. He positioned himself at the back, partially hidden by a support column, as Mayor Jenkins took the stage to introduce the next performer. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate indeed to have genuine musical culture come to our humble town. Please welcome our new music teacher, Miss Tabitha Zimmerman, who will perform several selections on the piano." The applause was enthusiastic as Tabitha took the stage. Wyatt's breath caught slightly at the sight of her. Gone was the practical skirt and simple blouse he was accustomed to seeing. Instead, she wore a dress of deep burgundy that complemented her coloring perfectly, her hair arranged in an elegant style that highlighted the graceful curve of her neck. She seated herself at the piano, a somewhat battered instrument that paled in comparison to the one at Lone Pine, and began to play. The piece started softly, almost tentatively, before building to a passionate crescendo that showcased both the music and her considerable talent. The audience was rapt, many having never heard classical music performed with such skill. When she finished the first piece, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. She played 2 more selections before standing to acknowledge the audience's appreciation with a modest bow. "For my final piece," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I'd like to play something that may be more familiar to many of you. Music isn't just about grand compositions, it's about the melodies that speak to our hearts and connect us to our memories." She returned to the piano and began a simple, beautiful arrangement of Shenandoah. The poignant melody seemed to touch something in the audience. Wyatt noticed several older women dabbing at their eyes. The familiar tune, elevated by Tabitha's sensitive interpretation, created a moment of shared emotion throughout the hall. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence before thunderous applause erupted. Tabitha rose, clearly moved by the reception, and curtsied deeply. Mayor Jenkins returned to the stage, beaming. "Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we can all agree that Redemption Creek has been blessed by Miss Zimmerman's arrival." He turned to her. "And now, I believe you'll be favoring us by playing for the dancing portion of our festivities." "It would be my pleasure," she agreed. The crowd began to disperse, some moving toward the refreshment tables while others helped clear space in the center of the hall for dancing. Wyatt remained where he was, uncertain whether to leave or stay. The decision was made for him when Tabitha, making her way through well-wishers, spotted him in his shadowy corner. Her face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Mr. Nash, you came after all." He shifted uncomfortably. "Just happened to be in town." "Of course," she said, though her smile suggested she didn't believe him. "Did you enjoy the music? You play very well," he admitted, better than on Morgan's piano. Different, certainly. Each instrument has its own character. She glanced toward the cleared dance floor where couples were beginning to gather. I should take my place for the dancing. Will you stay? Just to observe. Her eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes observation is the first step toward participation, Mr. Nash. Before he could respond to that cryptic statement, she was called away to the piano. Soon, the lively strains of a Virginia reel filled the hall, and couples formed lines for the energetic dance. Wyatt moved to the edge of the room, leaning against the wall and watching as Redemption Creek citizens, from dignified matrons to giggling young ladies, from serious businessmen to awkward cowboys, shed their daily concerns in the joy of movement and music. Despite himself, he found his foot tapping slightly to the rhythm. After an hour of playing dance tunes, Tabitha was relieved by Fred Simmons and his fiddle for a short break. She made her way through the crowd, accepting compliments and declining dance offers with gracious smiles. Wyatt, still in his corner, was surprised when she approached him directly, a cup of punch in each hand. "You look like you could use this," she said, offering him one. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. "You must be tired after all that playing." "It's a pleasant kind of tired," she said, sipping her punch. "There's something wonderful about creating music that brings people together like this." They stood in companionable silence, watching the dancers. Fred Simmons had struck up a waltz and couples were moving around the floor in graceful circles. "Why don't you dance, Mr. Nash?" Tabitha asked suddenly, her tone gentle but direct. He stiffened. "I told you I don't dance." "That's not an answer to why." "It's the only answer you're going to get," he said, more sharply than intended. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I apologize for prying. It's none of my business." The music shifted to a slower, more melancholy waltz. Something in the melody must have struck Tabitha, for her expression softened, and she closed her eyes briefly, swaying almost imperceptibly to the rhythm. "This was my parents' favorite," she said quietly. "Father would hum it while twirling Mother around our parlor on Sunday afternoons. After they died, I couldn't bear to hear it for years. Now it brings comfort rather than pain." The simple confidence, offered without expectation of reciprocation, touched something in Wyatt. Before he could reconsider, words were leaving his mouth. "I was 19 when my family's farm was attacked," he said, his voice low. "Tennessee, spring of '59. There was a dance in the nearby town, first one I'd ever attended. I was so determined to go that I neglected to properly secure the livestock. My parents stayed behind to fix my mistake." Tabitha remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might stop his words. "Raiders came while I was gone. Confederate irregulars, though the war hadn't officially started. They were looking for horses, supplies. My father resisted." He took a breath. "By the time I got back, the house was burning. My parents were inside. Oh, Wyatt," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, "I'm so sorry." "I haven't danced since," he concluded, draining his punch cup. "Excuse me." He pushed away from the wall and strode out of the hall into the cool night air, wondering what madness had possessed him to reveal such things to this woman he barely knew. Behind him, the music continued, the sound of carefree laughter a stark contrast to the memories that now clawed at his mind. He was halfway to his horse when he heard quick footsteps behind him. "Mr. Nash, wait," Tabitha called, slightly breathless from hurrying after him. He stopped but didn't turn. "Go back to the dance, Miss Zimmerman. I shouldn't have said anything." She moved around to face him, her expression earnest in the moonlight. "But you did say something. After 3 years in Redemption Creek, you finally told someone what happened. That matters. It doesn't change anything, doesn't it?" She stepped closer. You've been punishing yourself for 13 years for something that wasn't your fault. Anger flared in him. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Her voice was steady. I spent years blaming myself for not being home when my parents fell ill. If I'd been there instead of at my aunt's, perhaps I could have nursed them better than the hired help. Perhaps they wouldn't have died. It's not the same. No, it's not, she agreed. But the weight of misplaced guilt is similar. And I know something else. Too holding on to it doesn't honor their memory. It just prevents you from living. Her words struck too close to home, breaking through defenses long maintained. What do you want from me, Miss Zimmerman? Her answer was simple. A dance. He stared at her, certain he'd misheard. What? One dance, Mr. Nash. Not in there, she gestured toward the hall, but right here under the stars. No audience, no expectations. I told you I don't dance. Yes, I know. Her smile was gentle but determined. Consider it a first step toward letting go of the past. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but perhaps forgiving yourself a little. There's no music, he said weakly, grasping at practical objections. I'll hum, she countered, or we can listen to what drifts from the hall. As if on cue, the strains of a slow waltz floated through the open doors. Wyatt stood frozen, torn between the instinct to flee and an unexpected, powerful desire to take what she offered, not just a dance, but a moment of human connection, a potential bridge across the chasm of his self-imposed isolation. Tabitha seemed to sense his internal conflict. With grace and extraordinary courage, she stepped forward and simply took his hand. Her touch was warm, real, anchoring him to the present moment rather than the haunted past. Just one dance, she said softly. Then you can go home and continue avoiding dances and pianos and connections for the rest of your life if you choose. Perhaps it was the music, or the moonlight, or the simple human contact after years of keeping everyone at arm's length. Whatever the reason, Wyatt Nash found himself placing his other hand at Tabitha's waist, allowing her to position his feet, and following her lead as she began a simple box step to the distant waltz. He moved stiffly at first, afraid of stepping on her toes or making a fool of himself. But Tabitha was patient, her encouragement wordless but clear in the gentle pressure of her hand on his shoulder, the subtle guidance in her steps. Gradually, he began to relax, muscle memory from that long-ago dance returning. They moved together under the canopy of stars, two people finding unexpected harmony. The music from the hall provided rhythm, but Wyatt realized he was no longer really hearing it, he was feeling it, through the connection of their joined hands, through the synchronized movement of their bodies. When the waltz ended, they slowed to a stop, but neither immediately stepped away. For a suspended moment, Wyatt looked down into Tabitha's upturned face, struck by the openness he saw there. No judgment, no pity, just quiet understanding and something else, something that made his heart beat faster. Thank you for the dance, Mr. Nash, she said softly. Wyatt, he corrected, his voice rougher than usual. I think you've earned the right to call me Wyatt. Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. Tabitha, then. The moment stretched, fragile and pregnant with possibility. Then from the hall came the sound of Fred Simmons announcing the final dance of the evening, breaking the spell. I should get back, Tabitha said, reluctantly stepping away. I promised to play the closing number. Wyatt nodded, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands now that they were empty of her. I'll wait, to escort you back to the ranch. Surprise and pleasure brightened her face. I'd appreciate that. As she hurried back to the hall, Wyatt remained where he was, the phantom sensation of her hand in his lingering like a promise. One dance she had asked for, one dance he had given. But something told him this was only the beginning of a much longer journey, one he was suddenly, unexpectedly willing to consider. The days following the Harvest Festival brought subtle but significant changes to Lone Pine Ranch. Wyatt found himself seeking reasons to be near the main house when Tabitha came to play the piano. Twice, he accepted her invitation to sit in the parlor while she practiced. Once, he even requested a particular song he remembered from childhood, watching in quiet appreciation as her fingers coaxed the melody from the keys. For her part, Tabitha seemed to bloom in his company. She spoke more freely about her life before Colorado, her years teaching at the seminary, her love of literature, her dreams of someday opening her own music school. She asked questions about ranching and listened with genuine interest to his explanations of cattle breeding and pasture rotation. They fell into a routine of sharing evening meals twice weekly, alternating between his dining room and her cabin. Tabitha proved to be an excellent cook, transforming simple ingredients into memorable dishes. Wyatt, who had subsisted on basic fare for years, found himself looking forward to these dinners more than he cared to admit. The ranch hands noticed the change in their boss. Diego Rodriguez, never one to mind his own business, commented one morning as they rode out to check the western pasture. "Boss, don't take this wrong," he said with characteristic directness, "but you've been almost pleasant lately. The men are wondering if you're sick." Wyatt shot him a look. "Maybe I'm just satisfied with how the operation is running." Diego grinned. "Sure. Nothing to do with the pretty music teacher then. Miss Zimmerman is a tenant and a friend," Wyatt said firmly. "Nothing more, if you say so." Diego's tone was skeptical, but a blind man could see how you light up when she's around. Wyatt changed the subject abruptly, but the conversation lingered in his mind. Was he really so transparent? And more troublingly, was Diego right about his feelings? The idea of developing deeper emotions for Tabitha was both appealing and terrifying. After years of carefully avoiding attachments, the prospect of caring deeply for someone again meant risking the kind of pain he'd sworn never to experience a second time. November arrived with biting winds and the first dusting of snow across the high country. Winter came early to this part of Colorado, and with it, new challenges for the ranch. Cattle had to be brought down from summer pastures, hay stores checked, buildings winterized. Wyatt was concerned about Tabitha's cabin. Though solid, it wasn't designed for the bitter cold of mountain winters. When he expressed this worry during one of their dinners, she reminded him of her arrangement to board with Reverend Williams and his family in town during the worst months. "I've already discussed it with Mrs. Williams," she said. "I'll move to town after Thanksgiving and return when the weather improves in spring." The thought of not seeing her daily cast an unexpected pall over Wyatt's mood. "That's probably wise," he said, trying to sound neutral. Though the cabin could be made warmer with additional insulation and a better stove. Tabitha studied him across the table, a small smile playing at her lips. "Are you suggesting I should stay, Wyatt?" He busied himself with his coffee cup. "Just stating facts. It's your decision." She let the subject drop, but Wyatt caught her watching him thoughtfully for the rest of the evening. The next morning, he rode to town and purchased the best cast iron stove the mercantile had available, along with heavy wool batting for insulation and extra blankets. When questioned by a smirking Martha Holloway, he maintained it was simply responsible landlord behavior. Her knowing, indeed, Mr. Nash suggested she believed otherwise. Wyatt and Diego installed the new stove 2 days later, working to properly vent it and ensure it would provide maximum heat. They added the insulation beneath the floorboards and in the roof space, making the small cabin considerably snugger. Tabitha was teaching in town during these improvements, returning late in the afternoon to find her home transformed. Her delight was evident as she explored the changes, running her hands over the gleaming new stove and testing its heat output. "This is wonderful," she exclaimed. "It's like a completely different cabin." Wyatt, who had stayed to ensure the stove was operating correctly, tried to downplay his efforts. "Just practical improvements. Winter's harsh up here." She gave him a look that suggested she understood perfectly well the care that had gone into the upgrades. "Well, whatever your motivation, I'm grateful. This changes my plans considerably." "Oh," he tried to sound casual. "I think I'll delay my move to town at least until January. This should keep me comfortable through the early winter." The pleasure this announcement gave him was disproportionate to its significance, but Wyatt couldn't deny the relief he felt. "That's good, practical." Tabitha stepped closer, her expression earnest. "Wyatt, may I ask you something?" He nodded cautiously. "Would you be disappointed if I moved to town?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Honesty warred with his habitual reserve. "Yes," he finally admitted, the word seeming to cost him considerable effort. Her smile was worth the discomfort of the confession. "Then I'm especially glad for these improvements." She reached out and briefly touched his arm, the contact sending warmth through him despite its brevity. "Thank you." That evening, instead of returning immediately to the main house, Wyatt accepted Tabitha's invitation to stay for supper. As they sat across from each other at her small table, sharing a simple meal of stew and fresh bread, the intimacy of the setting struck him forcefully. This wasn't just neighborly friendship or landlord-tenant courtesy. This was something deeper, something growing between them with each passing day. The realization should have sent him retreating back into his protective shell. Instead, he found himself leaning into it, responding to her smile with one of his own, allowing the conversation to flow more freely than it ever had before. They spoke of books they had read, places they had seen, small moments that had shaped their lives. Tabitha described the first time she'd performed in public, a terrified 8-year-old playing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" at a church social. Wyatt shared memories of fishing with his father in the creek behind their Tennessee farm, learning to read the water and understand the habits of trout. When the conversation turned to holiday traditions, Wyatt realized with a start that Thanksgiving was only 2 weeks away. "You have plans?" he asked. "For Thanksgiving, I mean." Tabitha shook her head. "The Williamses invited me, but with 6 children already crowded around their table, I declined. I thought I might have a quiet dinner here." Alone. The idea bothered him more than it should have. "I've had many holidays alone," she said without self-pity. "It doesn't diminish the day." Wyatt hesitated, then plunged ahead before he could reconsider. "Have dinner with me, at the main house." Surprise flickered across her face, followed by pleasure. "Are you sure?" "I know you value your privacy." "I'm sure," he said, surprising himself with how certain he felt. "Unless you'd prefer solitude." "I'd be honored to share Thanksgiving with you," she said softly. The 2 weeks before Thanksgiving passed in a flurry of ranch work for Wyatt and teaching for Tabitha. The weather held relatively mild for November, allowing both to maintain their routines without difficulty. They continued their shared meals, each one strengthening the connection between them. Wyatt found himself thinking of Tabitha at odd moments throughout his days, wondering if she would enjoy the sunset from the western ridge. Imagining her reaction to the family of foxes he spotted near the creek, looking forward to telling her about Diego's youngest daughter taking her first steps. Small things, ordinary things, but somehow transformed by the prospect of sharing them with her. For Thanksgiving, Wyatt arranged to have Mrs. Rodriguez prepare traditional dishes in the cookhouse before taking the holiday off with her family. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Wyatt spent extra time grooming himself, trimming his beard and selecting his best shirt and vest. When Tabitha arrived at the main house mid-afternoon, she took his breath away. She wore a dress of deep forest green that complemented her coloring perfectly, her hair arranged in an elegant knot with a few tendrils framing her face. In her hands, she carried a covered dish that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. "Apple cobbler," she explained, following his gaze to the dish. "My mother's recipe. I hope you like sweets." "On occasion," he said, taking the dish from her and ushering her inside. "You look very nice." It was an inadequate compliment for how she appeared, but Tabitha accepted it with a warm smile. "Thank you. So do you." The main house had been transformed for the occasion. Wyatt had cleaned thoroughly, arranged fresh pine boughs on the mantel, and set the dining table with the good china that had remained unused in the sideboard since he'd purchased the property. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing light over the polished wood floors. Tabitha took it all in with evident appreciation. "Wyatt, this is lovely. You've gone to such effort," he shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise but pleased by her reaction. It seemed appropriate for the holiday. They moved to the dining room where the table was already laid with a feast: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and various vegetable dishes. "Mrs. Rodriguez outdid herself," Tabitha commented. "She enjoys having someone appreciate her cooking," Wyatt said. "The hands aren't always as thankful as they should be." They seated themselves at the table, Wyatt at the head and Tabitha to his right. There was a moment of slightly awkward silence before she spoke. "Would you mind if I said grace? It's tradition in my family." "Please," he gestured for her to proceed. She bowed her head, and after a moment's hesitation, he did the same. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this beautiful day and the bounty before us. We're grateful for the hands that prepared this meal, for the land that provides our sustenance, and for the company we share. Bless this food to our use and us to your service. Amen." "Amen," Wyatt echoed, the familiar words bringing unexpected memories of his mother's Thanksgiving prayers. They began serving themselves, the initial formality gradually giving way to comfortable conversation. Tabitha shared amusing stories about her music students' progress and misadventures, while Wyatt found himself talking more openly than usual about the challenges and satisfactions of running the ranch. "I never expected to be a rancher," he admitted as they lingered over second helpings. "After the war, I drifted west with no particular purpose. Working cattle was just a way to earn meals at first." "What changed?" Tabitha asked. He considered the question. "I found I had a knack for it, understanding cattle, reading weather, managing land. And I liked the open spaces, the distance from towns and crowds. The solitude," she suggested. "That too at first," he acknowledged, though lately." He trailed off, uncertain how to express the shift in his thinking. "Lately," she prompted gently. "Lately, I've been reconsidering the value of solitude," he finished, meeting her eyes directly. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Tabitha's cheeks colored slightly, but she held his gaze. "I'm glad to hear that," she said softly. After dinner, they moved to the parlor with coffee and Tabitha's apple cobbler. The intimate setting, with just the firelight and a few lamps illuminating the room, created an atmosphere that felt separate from ordinary time, a pocket of warmth and connection in the vast, cold landscape beyond the windows. Tabitha settled herself at the piano, her fingers moving lightly over the keys without pressing them. "Would you mind if I played something, as a thank you for this wonderful dinner?" "I'd like that," Wyatt said, settling into an armchair with his coffee. She began with a gentle melody. He didn't recognize something that spoke of gratitude and contentment. As she played, Wyatt found himself watching not just her hands but the expressions that crossed her face, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the soft smile when she reached a particularly pleasing phrase, the way she sometimes closed her eyes briefly, lost in the music. When she finished, she turned on the bench to face him. "That was Beethoven's Für Elise, do you know it?" He shook his head. "It's beautiful. Would you?" She hesitated, then continued with quiet courage. "Would you like to dance again, Wyatt?" The question hung in the air between them. A month ago, he would have refused immediately, retreating behind his wall of painful memories. Now, looking at Tabitha's hopeful expression, he found the reflexive refusal dying on his lips. "How would that work with you playing?" he asked instead. Her smile brightened at what was not a rejection. "I could hum, as I suggested before, or—" She glanced around the room. "Do you have a music box, perhaps?" "There's one in the study," he said, remembering an item he discovered in a drawer shortly after purchasing the property. "I don't know if it still works. Shall we find out?" They moved to the small study off the main hallway, where Wyatt rummaged through a desk drawer before producing a tarnished silver music box. He wound the key experimentally, and to their mutual surprise, the mechanism still functioned, producing a tinkling rendition of "Beautiful Dreamer." "Perfect," Tabitha declared, setting it on the desk where the sound could fill the room. She turned to Wyatt, extending her hand. "May I have this dance, Mr. Nash?" This time, there was less hesitation. He took her offered hand, placed his other at her waist, and began to lead her in a simple waltz around the confines of the small study. They moved together more naturally than before, finding a shared rhythm that felt both new and somehow familiar. "You're a quick learner," Tabitha observed as he guided her through a turn. "Or perhaps I've found the right partner," he replied, surprising himself with the sentiment. Her eyes, looking up into his, reflected the lamplight, and something deeper, a warmth that called to him like a beacon in the wilderness of his solitary existence. The music box played on, but Wyatt barely heard it now, his attention fully captured by the woman in his arms and the extraordinary feeling of rightness in this moment. As the melody wound down, their steps slowed until they were barely moving, simply standing close together in the middle of the room. Wyatt was acutely aware of Tabitha's hand in his, the slight pressure of his palm at her waist, the way her breath quickened slightly when he drew her fractionally closer. "Tabitha," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Yes." Her response was barely above a whisper. Words failed him. Instead, with a courage born of newfound emotion rather than battlefield necessity, Wyatt Nash lowered his head and gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, tentative, a question rather than a demand. When he drew back slightly, uncertainty clouding his expression, Tabitha answered by rising on her toes to return the kiss with gentle assurance. Time seemed to stand still in that moment, past regrets and future uncertainties temporarily suspended in the simple, profound connection of two people discovering in each other the possibility of a shared life rather than parallel solitude. When they finally separated, Tabitha's eyes were bright with emotion. "I've been hoping you might do that," she admitted with characteristic honesty. A smile rare and genuine transformed Wyatt's usually stern features. "I've been thinking about it more than I should admit." She laughed softly. "I believe in this case, actions speak louder than admissions." They returned to the parlor, the dynamic between them subtly but fundamentally altered. As they sat together on the settee, closer than propriety might strictly allow, Tabitha nestled against Wyatt's side while they watched the fire dance in the hearth. "What happens now?" she asked after a comfortable silence. Wyatt considered the question carefully. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "This is, Unfamiliar territory for me. For me as well, she said. Though I must confess I've been drawn to you since our first meeting. Even when I was being difficult, especially then, she teased. There's something compelling about a man who tries so hard to be forbidding yet can't quite hide his essential decency. He raised an eyebrow. Is that how you see me? It's one aspect, she said thoughtfully. I see many things in you, Wyatt Nash, strength, certainly, and determination. But also kindness, integrity, and a capacity for joy that perhaps you've forgotten was there. Her perception was disarming. And what do you want from me, Tabitha? He asked softly. She turned slightly to look directly into his eyes. Just the chance to know you better. To see if what's growing between us might become something lasting. The simplicity and honesty of her answer touched him deeply. I'd like that too, he said, though I should warn you I'm out of practice at caring for someone. We can learn together, she suggested, taking his hand and twining her fingers with his. As the fire burned low and the November night deepened around the ranch house, Wyatt Nash and Tabitha Zimmerman began to tentatively map the contours of a future neither had anticipated, but both now found themselves eager to explore. December brought heavy snows and temperatures that plummeted well below freezing. Despite the new stove and insulation, Tabitha's cabin became increasingly difficult to keep warm as winter tightened its grip on the Colorado high country. After a particularly brutal storm left 4-foot drifts between the cabin and the main house, Wyatt insisted she temporarily relocate to one of the guest bedrooms in the ranch house. It's not proper, she protested weakly, even as she huddled near her stove in multiple layers of clothing. Freezing to death is less proper, he countered. The hands know you're my tenant, and propriety matters less than your safety. In truth, both understood that their relationship had evolved beyond landlord and tenant, though they'd been careful to maintain appearances of conventional friendship. The ranch hands might suspect more, particularly after seeing their boss's transformation from taciturn loner to a man occasionally caught smiling for no apparent reason, but no one commented directly. Tabitha agreed to the arrangement, moving into the ranch house with a few essentials while the worst of the cold snap continued. What was intended as a temporary measure, however, gradually took on a feeling of permanence. Her presence brought life to the austere rooms. Fresh flowers appeared on the dining table despite the season. Books accumulated in the parlor, and music filled the house at regular intervals. For Wyatt, the change was profound. After years of existing in Spartan solitude, he discovered the pleasure of sharing simple daily rituals: morning coffee at the kitchen table, evening conversations by the fire, the comforting knowledge of another presence in the house. Though they maintained separate bedrooms and appropriate decorum, the emotional intimacy between them deepened with each passing day. They celebrated Christmas quietly but joyfully. Wyatt surprised Tabitha by cutting a small pine tree from the north ridge and setting it up in the parlor. Together, they decorated it with simple ornaments fashioned from pine cones, ribbon, and candles. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged modest gifts: a finely crafted leather-bound journal from Wyatt to Tabitha, and from her to him, a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool that matches your eyes, she told him with a smile. That evening they shared a special dinner, and then sat together at the piano, where Tabitha played Christmas carols and Wyatt, to her delight, even sang along to the ones he remembered from childhood. Later, as they stood before the fire, the room illuminated only by the tree candles and the hearth's glow, Wyatt took both her hands in his. "Tabitha," he began, uncharacteristic nervousness evident in his voice, "these past weeks, having you here." He paused, searching for words. She squeezed his hands encouragingly. "Yes, I don't want to go back to how things were before, he said finally. Before you, her eyes softened. Neither do I. I'm not asking. That is, I know it's too soon for formal arrangements, he continued, but I wanted you to know my intentions are serious. A smile bloomed on her face. As are mine, Wyatt. He drew her closer, one hand moving to gently cup her cheek. I never expected to find you when I bought this ranch. I thought I'd live out my days alone and be content with that. And now, she prompted softly. Now I can't imagine my life without your music in it, he said simply. Without you in it. Their kiss was deeper than the first they'd shared, filled with growing confidence and the promise of a future together. When they separated, Tabitha's eyes were bright with happiness and unshed tears. Merry Christmas, Wyatt Nash, she whispered. Merry Christmas, Tabitha Zimmerman, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. January brought no reprieve from winter's grip. Snow continued to fall regularly, and temperatures remained bitterly cold. Tabitha officially moved her remaining possessions from the cabin to the main house, acknowledging what both had come to understand her place was with Wyatt, propriety be damned. She still traveled to town 3 days a week to teach, though often the weather made this difficult. On several occasions, Wyatt insisted on driving her himself in the enclosed sleigh, unwilling to risk her safety on the treacherous roads. These trips gave them the opportunity to be seen together in public, gradually accustoming the townspeople to their developing relationship. Gossip, of course, was inevitable. Martha Holloway made it her personal mission to extract details whenever either of them visited the mercantile. Reverend Williams, more tactfully, inquired after Tabitha's well-being and living arrangements during her lessons with his children, offering gentle guidance if needed. Most people, however, seemed genuinely pleased to see the change in the formerly reclusive rancher. You know they're all talking about us, Tabitha commented one evening as they returned from town after attending a church social. Let them talk, Wyatt replied, tucking the lap blanket more securely around her in the sleigh. Does it bother you? She considered this. Not the talk itself, no. But I am conscious of not wanting to damage your reputation in the community. He chuckled. My reputation was as a standoffish curmudgeon who avoided social gatherings and never danced. I'd say any change is an improvement. His easy humor, once so rare, had become more frequent in recent months, another sign of the transformation Tabitha had brought to his life. Still, she persisted, people can be judgmental about a woman living in a man's house without the sanction of marriage. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses through a particularly deep drift before responding. Would marriage solve your concerns? Tabitha's breath caught. Wyatt Nash, if that's a proposal, it leaves much to be desired in terms of romance. Despite the darkness, she could see his smile. It wasn't. When I propose and I will, you'll know it. The promise warmed her more effectively than the blanket or the hot bricks at their feet. February brought Valentine's Day, and with it, Wyatt's opportunity to make good on his promise. He planned carefully, enlisting Diego's help for certain arrangements while sending Tabitha to town for the day on the pretext of needing special supplies that only she could select. When she returned in the afternoon, the ranch house had been transformed. Fresh flowers, a miraculous feat in midwinter, accomplished through Diego's sister-in-law who worked at the hotel and had access to their conservatory, adorned every room. The dining table was set with the finest china and crystal, candles ready to be lit. Wyatt. She called, removing her coat and gloves in the entryway. What's all this? He appeared from the kitchen, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He dressed in his best suit, the one he'd purchased in Denver last fall but had never worn. His hair was freshly trimmed, his beard neatly groomed. Welcome home, he said, taking her packages and setting them aside. "I hope your trip to town was successful." "It was, though I'm still not sure why I needed to select new hinges with such specific dimensions," she said suspiciously. "Especially since Mr. Johnson at the hardware store seemed confused by my request." Wyatt had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I may have invented that errand." "I suspected as much," she said, gesturing to the flowers and candles. "This explains a great deal." "Is it a special occasion I've forgotten, Valentine's Day?" he reminded her. "But also, something else, something more important." He took her hand and led her to the parlor, which had been similarly decorated with flowers and candles. The piano stood open, sheet music placed ready for playing. But what caught Tabitha's attention immediately was a small wooden box sitting on top of the instrument. "What is this, Wyatt?" He guided her to the piano bench, seating her before taking the box in his hands. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "Tabitha," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "when you first came to Lone Pine, I was a man who thought his life was settled. I believed I'd made peace with solitude, with a future lived alone with my memories and regrets." He knelt before her, still holding the box. "You changed everything. Your music, your laughter, your remarkable courage in reaching out to a stranger who did everything possible to remain unreachable." Tabitha's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent, giving him time to say what he needed to say. "You asked me to dance when I thought I never would again. You brought light back into rooms that had been dark for too long. You helped me understand that honoring the past doesn't mean sacrificing the future." He opened the box, revealing a ring, a delicate gold band set with a perfect diamond flanked by two smaller sapphires. "I love you, Tabitha Zimmerman. Will you marry me?" Joy bloomed across her face like sunrise after the longest night. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Wyatt Nash, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her hand. Then he rose and drew her to her feet, into an embrace that spoke of promises kept and new beginnings. "I never thought I'd find love again," he murmured against her hair. "Never thought I'd want to." "Sometimes life brings unexpected gifts," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "You are mine." Their engagement announcement caused a stir in Redemption Creek, though most expressed genuine pleasure at the news. Plans were made for a spring wedding, as soon as the mountain passes cleared enough for Tabitha's aunt from Philadelphia to travel west for the ceremony. The remaining winter months passed in a flurry of preparations and deepening connection. Wyatt and Tabitha spent long evenings discussing their future, practical matters like the running of the ranch, dreams of expanding the music program in town, possibilities of children someday. They also addressed more immediate concerns, such as renovations to the main house to better suit a family home rather than a bachelor's austere dwelling. With the first signs of spring in late March, Wyatt began implementing some of these changes. The formal dining room was brightened with fresh paint and new curtains selected by Tabitha. The study was reorganized to accommodate her music books and teaching materials alongside his ranch ledgers. Upstairs, they chose a bedroom to be their shared chamber after the wedding, selecting new furniture and bedding together in a visit to Denver that left Wyatt slightly scandalized but secretly pleased by Tabitha's practical approach to their future intimacy. April brought milder weather, melting snows, and the arrival of Tabitha's Aunt Alina, a formidable widow with sharp eyes and sharper wit, who subjected Wyatt to a thorough interrogation before declaring him acceptable, if somewhat rough around the edges. "She likes you," Tabitha assured him after the first dinner with her aunt. "She wouldn't have bothered asking so many questions if she didn't. If that was liking, I'd hate to see her displeasure, Wyatt muttered, but with good humor. The wedding was set for the third Saturday in April. By mutual agreement, they planned a relatively simple ceremony in Redemption Creek's church, followed by a celebration at the Opera House. The entire town seemed determined to participate. Martha Holloway organized a committee of ladies to handle decorations. Reverend Williams counseled them on their vows, and even Sheriff Raleigh contributed by ensuring the saloons would maintain decorum on the big day. The night before the wedding, after a lively rehearsal dinner at the hotel with Aunt Alina, Diego and his family, and a few close friends from town, Wyatt and Tabitha took a moment alone on the hotel's small balcony. "This time tomorrow, you'll be Mrs. Nash," Wyatt said, his arm around her shoulders as they looked up at the star-filled sky. "And you'll be stuck with a wife who practices scales at dawn and insists you dance at least once a month," she teased. "A fair trade for a lifetime of your smile," he replied with uncharacteristic poetry. She turned in his embrace to face him. "Are you nervous?" He considered the question honestly. "Not about marrying you, never that. Perhaps a little about being the center of attention tomorrow. You know how I feel about crowds." "Just look at me," she suggested. "Pretend no one else is there." "That," he said, pulling her closer, "will be the easiest instruction I've ever followed." Wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature herself approved the union. Redemption Creek's small church was filled to capacity, wildflowers adorning every pew and sunlight streaming through the simple stained glass windows. Wyatt stood at the altar, Diego beside him as best man, feeling strangely calm despite the sea of faces turned expectantly toward him. When the door opened, and Tabitha appeared on the arm of Reverend Williams, standing in for her late father, his world narrowed to just her radiant in a gown of ivory satin, her hair crowned with spring blossoms, her smile as bright as the morning sun. She moved toward him with graceful confidence, and when the Reverend placed her hand in his, Wyatt felt a sense of rightness so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, spoken clearly for all to hear. Wyatt, who had once been a man of few words, found them flowing easily now as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Tabitha for all his days. When he slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his purpose sure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Williams declared. "You may kiss your bride." Wyatt drew Tabitha gently into his arms and sealed their union with a kiss that balanced proper restraint with unmistakable devotion. The church erupted in applause and a few good-natured cheers. The celebration afterward was everything a wedding party should be: abundant food, flowing drinks, though not too flowing, thanks to Sheriff Raleigh's watchful eye, and music provided by Tabitha's most talented students along with Fred Simmons and his fiddle. The highlight came when it was time for the first dance. The floor cleared and all eyes turned to the newlyweds. For a moment, Wyatt felt a flicker of his old reluctance, the weight of painful memories threatening to intrude on this joyful day. Tabitha sensed his hesitation. Standing before him in the center of the dance floor, she took both his hands in hers and leaned close to whisper, "Remember our first dance? Under the stars, just the two of us. This is no different, just you and me, Wyatt." He looked into her eyes that had seen past his defenses from the very beginning, that had recognized the man he could be even when he'd forgotten himself. Drawing strength from her unwavering faith in him, Wyatt Nash took his wife in his arms and led her in a waltz as graceful and confident as if he'd been dancing all his life. As they moved around the floor, other couples gradually joined them, but Wyatt remained focused solely on Tabitha, on the joy in her expression, the trust in her touch, the promise of their future written in every shared step. "Happy, Mrs. Nash?" he asked softly. "Perfectly," she replied. "And you?" He drew her imperceptibly closer. "Propriety be damned." "More than I ever thought possible." The music continued, and so did they, two people who had found in each other not just love but healing, not just companionship but completion. And as the afternoon light slanted through the opera house windows, casting golden beams across the dance floor, Wyatt Nash, a man who once had sworn never to dance again, moved in perfect harmony with his wife, each step taking them further from solitary pasts and deeper into their shared future. Epilogue. 5 years later, the music from the piano drifted through the open windows of Lone Pine Ranch's main house, mingling with the sound of children's laughter from the yard outside. Tabitha Nash's fingers moved expertly over the keys, playing a simple melody while her 4-year-old daughter, Eleanor, sang along in a sweet, if not entirely on-key voice. "Again, Mama," the little girl demanded when the song ended, her hazel eyes so like her mother's, bright with enthusiasm. "One more time," Tabitha agreed, "and then we need to finish preparing for Papa and James to return." She began the song again, smiling as Eleanor's dark curls bounced with her energetic movements. At the far end of the parlor, 2-year-old James's wooden blocks lay abandoned evidence of the young boy's earlier play before he'd convinced his father to take him along to check the nearby pastures. The past 5 years had transformed Lone Pine Ranch from merely a successful cattle operation to a true family home. The once sparse rooms now overflowed with the comfortable clutter of a well-lived life: children's toys, books, musical instruments, family portraits. The kitchen garden had expanded to include not just vegetables but flowers and herbs, and a small orchard of apple trees was beginning to produce its first modest harvest. Tabitha herself had undergone changes as well. While still teaching music in town 2 days a week, she had focused much of her energy on raising their children and creating a harmonious home. Motherhood suited her, bringing new depth to her already generous spirit and a fierce protectiveness that sometimes surprised even herself. Wyatt had perhaps changed the most dramatically. The guarded, solitary man who had once avoided human connection now moved through life with open joy, especially where his family was concerned. He remained a respected rancher, his operation now one of the most prosperous in the territory, but his greatest pride came from the moments shared with his wife and children, teaching James to ride his first pony, listening to Eleanor's beginning piano lessons, holding Tabitha close under the stars on their private evenings on the porch. The sound of horses approaching interrupted Tabitha's playing. Eleanor scrambled down from the piano bench and raced to the window. "Papa's back, and James," she announced excitedly. "Can I go meet them?" "Yes, but stay on the porch until Papa gets down from his horse," Tabitha cautioned, rising to follow her daughter at a more measured pace. Outside, Wyatt was just dismounting, carefully lifting little James from where the boy had been securely seated before him. Eleanor bounded down the porch steps, ignoring her mother's instructions as usual, and threw herself into her father's arms the moment he set James on his feet. "Papa, I learned a new song on the piano," she declared as he swung her up into a hug. "Did you now?" Wyatt replied, his face transformed by the smile he reserved for his children. "You'll have to play it for me after supper." "I will, and I didn't miss any notes, not even the hard ones," she assured him with typical confidence. "That's my girl." He set her down and turned to greet Tabitha, who had descended the steps with James now perched on her hip. "How are the new calves?" she asked, accepting his kiss. "Healthy and strong," he reported. "Diego thinks we'll have a record season." He took James from her, tousling the boy's dark hair. And this young cowboy was a big help, weren't you, son? James nodded solemnly. I counted cows, Mama. All the way to 3, Wyatt added with a wink at Tabitha. Very impressive, she said seriously, though her eyes danced with amusement. Now both of you should wash up. Supper will be ready soon. The family meal was lively, as always, with Alina chattering about her piano progress, James attempting to contribute with his limited vocabulary, and Wyatt and Tabitha exchanging glances of shared contentment over their children's heads. After the dishes were cleared, as promised, Alina performed her new piece for her father, beaming with pride at his enthusiastic applause. Later, once the children were tucked into bed and the house had quieted, Wyatt and Tabitha sat together on the porch swing, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight. His arm was around her shoulders, her head rested against him in the comfortable familiarity of long marriage. I had a letter from Aunt Alina today, Tabitha mentioned. She's considering visiting this summer. Heaven help us, Wyatt groaned, though without genuine concern. Over the years, he'd developed a grudging affection for his formidable aunt-in-law. The children will be impossible after she spoils them rotten. She claims it's her prerogative as their only great aunt, Tabitha laughed. Oh, and Martha Holloway cornered me at the Mercantile today. The town is planning a 10th anniversary celebration for the founding of the school, and they want me to organize a special music program. You'll do it beautifully, he said with complete confidence. Will you have the children participate? Alina, certainly. She's ready for a public performance. James can perhaps ring a bell at an appropriate moment. They shared a smile at the image of their son's likely enthusiastic but imperfectly timed contribution. I was thinking, Wyatt said after a comfortable silence, about the spring dance next month. Tabitha looked up at him curiously. What about it? I thought we might attend. He paused. Together, as a family. Her smile was radiant in the gathering darkness. You never cease to surprise me, Wyatt Nash. 5 years of marriage and still you find ways. Is that a yes? It's a most definite yes. She reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the scar that had once seemed to define him, but now was simply another aspect of the man she loved. You know, I still remember that first night at the Harvest Festival when you finally agreed to dance with me under the stars. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Best decision I ever made. Oh, I thought marrying me was the best decision you ever made, she teased. That was inevitable from the moment you took my hand that night, he said with surprising seriousness. You pulled me out of darkness, Tabitha, into a light I never thought I'd see again. Emotion welled in her eyes. And you let yourself be led. That took its own kind of courage. I found my courage in you, he said simply. As the night deepened around them, Wyatt Nash held his wife close, profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought them to this moment, from solitary souls to a family bound by love, from painful pasts to a joyful present, from darkness into enduring light. And somewhere in the house behind them, a piano waited for tomorrow's music, its presence a constant reminder of how a reluctant cowboy and a determined music teacher had found in each other the perfect countermelody to life's complex song.